to the colors.
We volunteered. We all had red, white, and blue fever.
And that I will obey the orders of the President of the United States.
The men and boys of D-Day came from all over the world. They were American, British, Canadian, and French. They came from different religious backgrounds. They left big cities and small towns to go off to war. Places like Houston, Texas, Rock Hill, South Carolina, and Woonsocket, Rhode Island. Many were just teenagers, and while some had fought in earlier battles in North Africa and Italy, most had never been in combat. June 6, 1944, would be cataclysmic. The future of democracy in the free world was on the line. But failure was always a real possibility.
Battles are won really in the hearts and the minds of the soldiers who are fighting them.
Allied Supreme Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower was placing the future of the world squarely in the hands of soldiers just old enough to drive a car or take a sip of beer. It was that same youth that had already helped turn the tide of the war prior to D-Day, so they too were handed the assignment of Operation Overlord. The invasion of Europe was gargantuan in its preparation, scope, and implementation. But for all its planning and practice, the landings on the coast of Normandy at low tide would depend on the individual GI, how he handled himself in battle, and whether he would be able to establish a foothold on the sandy coastline or be driven back into the English Channel in defeat. On the coast of France at 6:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944, the battle could have gone either way. And for many hours that day, there was doubt about whether Operation Overlord could succeed. The loss of life was indeed horrific, especially along the 7,000 yards of Omaha Beach, where the German defenses on General Erwin Rommel's so-called impregnable Atlantic Wall were the strongest. Men were killed before they could get off their landing craft. Bodies floated in a blood-red channel surf. Those who did make it onto Omaha Beach were often cut down as they tried to find cover from German gun positions, concealed as high as 170 feet above the bluffs. For those who were there at Omaha Beach, exposed in the open, it was worse than hell. Over 2,500 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing after just half a day of fighting. All along the Allied landing beaches, from Sword to Juneau and Gold to Omaha and Utah, and inland where airborne paratroops had landed the night before, the youth of the Allied nations rose to meet the challenge. Because of their grit and determination, the world would be forever changed.
Their unit cohesion was torn apart as they landed on the beach, but they huddled up against those limestone cliffs, and eventually that cohesion came back together because of the will of the soldiers. They understood the intent, they understood what was at stake, and they got together. And they fought, and they overcame the odds, and they moved inland, and they ended up accomplishing the mission that day.
Para recordar los acontecimientos. Una señora, un esqueleto. 5. Para aventar mis botas. A decirme gracias.
Welcome to International Roundtable. I'm your host, Pachi Valencia. Today, we'll learn about immense courage and patriotism of the millions of Latinos that have served in the U.S. military. It's time to meet our panel. Eric Lionheart, a first-generation Mexican immigrant. Eric served in the United States Air Force in security forces into the elite combat control team. He fought exclusively in Afghanistan, earning 2 Bronze Stars, one with valor for his heroic actions during a 4-hour firefight. Also, Rafael Bejar, Director of Outreach for the Texas Public Policy Foundation. He's a former Texas Regional Director of the Libre Institute. Welcome to both of you. Eric, I want to start with you. In that clip from Rudy Vara, a World War II Hispanic veteran, he details the horrors of war clinging to the soldier. And you have experienced that yourself, this horror of war. tell us your experience.
Thank you for having me during this period, and it's an honor to sit here with you. Yeah, war was, I think as a young man, everybody wants to see what they're made of, and go to war. When I joined the Air Force when I was 20 years old, I had no desire to join the military. I just wanted to get my college degree and get out. And 9/11 took place on my second enlistment, and it just sparked every patriotic bone I had in my body, and I wanted to go fight. Luckily, I met an Air Force combat controller, and he said, "Hey, man, we got these guys here in the Air Force. You should do that." And that's how it started. And I couldn't wait to get into war. I couldn't wait to go fight. And after the 2-year pipeline, which a lot of guys don't make it through, but I was one of the lucky ones. You get some more training, and then you start going to war. And it's surreal. It's surreal to be there. And the best thing is that you're surrounded by men that are just like you, that have the same belief. At the time it was God and country. And when you go to war, it's I tell people God made some of the best things, which are human, and some of the worst things that are also human. And we start looking at the violence and what another human can do to another. It just sticks with you. And it's in Afghanistan where I fought. It was it's just hard to believe what somebody else can do to someone just because of what they believe in or what gender they are, or it's just violent. And when I said earlier, when you're young, you can't wait to go to war. And it might sound strange to some of your viewers, but I really enjoyed it. I loved being around my element. The thing that haunted me after I left was the loss of my friends. My survivor's guilt was tremendous. And in fact, my last deployment, my team leader, who was with my ODA, was killed in an insider threat 2 weeks after I had just left. And that shook me to my core. I didn't want to go back. And I just knew I couldn't protect my team. And part of being a combat controller when you're assigned to these special forces teams is to protect the team above all else. And the policies we had in time were not the greatest for fighting. And after you lose guys that you love that way, it just starts haunting with you. And if you ever seen a mother cry over a casket, it's a terrible feeling. And that's to me,
we're gonna touch on that specific topic when it comes to the trauma left with the soldiers. But Rafa, you have researched the long and important history of Hispanics serving in the military, like Eric, and even going back to the Revolutionary War. Share it with us.
Absolutely. There are many stories of brave men, Hispanic men, Latino men, just as Eric, throughout the years. Hispanics have a rich and extensive history of serving in the U.S. military, dating back to the Revolutionary War, and we participated in every major conflict, including the Civil War, the World Wars, obviously the modern military operations, and we have 60 Medal of Honor winners throughout all this time period, throughout this history. And it's through their blood, sweat, and sacrifice that Hispanics are an integral part of the American story. If I may, I'll pull out one or two of the more significant Hispanics in each one of the conflicts, right? So you have in the American Revolutionary War, you have Bernardo de Galvez. He was actually not an American. He was the governor of Spanish Louisiana, but he tremendously helped the American patriotic cause by fighting the British in Florida, disrupting British shipping, and also it was through de Galvez's efforts that the famous Tejano cattle drives came from Texas, or what was known as Texas, to the U.S. colonies to help feed them by providing beef and leather. You also had a person by the name of George Farragut, who was originally a Spanish naval officer, and then he joined the South Carolina Navy, and he fought at the siege of Charlestown, where his arm was broken by a cannonball, and he also fought in the famous Battle of Cowpens. He also fought in the War of 1812. Moving forward, we have in the Texas War of Independence, you have obviously the very famous Colonel Juan Seguin, who was the leader of the Tejano forces, who fought alongside the Anglo-Texians to win independence for Texas, right? They did a lot of the scouting and the guerrilla war to keep the Texian forces alive, and they fought in the Battle of San Jacinto, which defeated the Mexican General Santa Anna. In the Civil War, Latinos were as divided as the rest of the nation. We had Latinos serving both in the Union Army and in the Confederate Army. And you had whole companies of Hispanics, mainly formed in Texas and California. One of them is Admiral David Farragut, who's actually the son of George Farragut, who fought in the American Revolutionary War. And he's a famous naval officer, and he commanded the Union naval forces at the Battle of Mobile. And he's very famous for issuing the command, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." And not only that, but because of that and many other acts of bravery, he was promoted to be the first rear admiral, the first vice admiral, and the first admiral of the U.S. Navy. And then on the Confederate side, you had Colonel Santos Benavides from the Laredo area, and he led a company of Tejano Confederate soldiers who fought in various battles, including the very last battle of the Civil War, which was fought in Texas. In World War I, you had two, marvelous examples of very brave Latinos. You had Nicholas Lucero, who was just 19. He was a 19-year-old boy from Albuquerque, and he received the French Croix de Guerre, which is, very high honor for destroying two German machine gun nests and maintaining constant fire for 2 hours during World War I. And then you also have the story of Marcelino Sedna, who was actually a Mexican living in the United States. And ironically enough, he was picked up and he was about to be deported. And he joined the army instead. And through various acts of bravery, he rose to be the highest decorated Texan in World War I. And was the first Hispanic to receive the Distinguished Service Cross.
That's a very impressive list. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
That's a very impressive list, Rafa. Thank you for sharing that. But Eric, you are a Mexican immigrant, like all these heroes that Rafa just mentioned. Were a lot of the guys you served with Latinos too?
Absolutely. I think most of my teams were made up of white men and Hispanic men. There was I'm sure there was other races in there, but for the most part, it was Hispanics and white males that we went to war. I don't know why that is, but that's where all my teams were made up of.
Mm-hmm. And Rafa, if you can tell us one of the reasons why Latinos were so interested in joining the U.S. military, even back to the Civil War, what would you think was the motivation behind?
Yeah, I think that, Latinos are very brave, they're very patriotic, very loyal. So you have that, and you also have there's the whole, I guess the glorification of going to war and, protecting or fighting for one's, country or for one's, homeland. And then also, certainly, back in the day, back in history, many of them wanted to prove that they were just as American as everybody else. And they wanted to show that, right? Back in the old days, we had, much more prevalent racism, and they wanted to show that, they were as American as anybody else, and they wanted to fight for their civil rights in this way and prove themselves.
Okay. So let's take a look at this clip. I want you to look at this Hispanic soldier who really showed his love for America.
My father said he's 18. He's a citizen. That's his duty. And I never thought otherwise, that I wouldn't go or that I shouldn't go.
They were often relegated to Mexican-only neighborhoods, schools, theaters, churches. Yet hundreds of thousands of Mexican Americans signed up to serve in World War II.
If you look at the statistics, you would have to conclude that 375 to half a million estimate out of a 2.69 million population is extraordinarily high. And remember that you also have Mexican American women serving in the armed forces, as well as Mexican nationals.
I had friends from Connecticut, Arkansas, California, Arizona, just all over the state. I felt like I belonged to this family.
Families with names like Correa and Ramirez sent all of their sons and even their daughters to join the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and the Air Corps, or do their part here on the home front, giving so much, even their lives for this country. For many, the armed forces turned out to be a great equalizer, and as you will see, gave returning veterans the courage off the battlefield to fight for equal opportunity.
And we will come back after this.
Earlier, and a great friend, Chris, the guy that I talked about in my earlier clip, he committed suicide 6 months after he left the teams. And probably 3-4 months later, another good teammate of mine was going to do the same thing. And the foundation started a necessity. But letting go of that, it's, people can read books and can watch war movies and it can get really knowledgeable of it. But until you've experienced that, there's no comparison. And, to let go of someone that was killed, especially most of us are such young men, and you lose that, it's a tremendous blow to the soul. And yeah, it's just to love your brother, and your countryman, whoever it is. It's just, for me especially, was very hard on me.
Rafa, I know this topic is also very fond of you. Why is it important to take care of veterans?
Quite honestly, because they put it all on the line for us, right? We wouldn't have the freedom that we enjoy, the rights, the liberties that we have in the United States, if it were not, brave men and women, such as Eric, and the long list of other veterans, Hispanic and non-Hispanic. Quite honestly, I mean, for that I don't see any distinction. You're a veteran, you're a veteran, and that and just as in the same way that they showed a duty and obligation to serve, I think that it's incumbent on American society to show a duty and obligation to help take care of them. And I also have friends who have suffered from PTSD and have committed suicide, and it's just very sad. It's very sad, and especially knowing after everything that they've gone through, and they're still struggling with it, and yet are not able to cope, or are not able to receive the help that they need to help cope. So I think that the work that Eric's doing through his foundation is desperately needed.
So what's not being done for them aside from what you mentioned? Is there anything else that veterans need?
I think it's just more service, right? The Veteran Affairs is trying to do as much as they can, but they're not able to handle all of it, right? And I think that there needs to be other avenues out there, again, much like what Eric is doing, to help these people. And that, quite honestly, I think a lot of it is personal, one-on-one, type of care to help them get through it.
Eric, are there signs of veterans that return from war that we should be looking at?
I think we all come back a little different. Even when we leave, my mom, when I came back, she knew I was different. I didn't feel like I was, but I mean, it's just certain little changes, right? There's more isolation, maybe finding more solace in the bottle, just not really wanting to communicate and be around people. And I think it's just because we don't fit in this world, right? When we come out of the military, I mean, you figure, especially men and women that go 20 years plus. I mean, they've been indoctrinated to a certain way of life, and all of a sudden they come out here and it's free fall. And like Rafa said, the VA is doing the best they can to manage all that. But I mean, in 22 years of fighting, for example, in Afghanistan, I mean, they're overwhelmed. Doug Collins, in his latest cabinet meeting with President Trump, he said, "Hey, we've dumped a ton of money into suicide prevention, but we're not really making any change." And he did mention there's nonprofits out there that are doing unconventional holistic treatments that are helping. And we're some complex beings that, I mean, there's room for everything out there. So we need to do something else. If we keep doing the same thing and just changing the color and saying, "Oh, suicide, let's prevent it," it's the definition of insanity, and I really hope that this new president, Doug Collins, being a veteran, he'll get in there and be open to new ideas that are actually going to change, and not only treat the service member, but also treat their spouse or their children, because we put them through hell when we were gone. I'm not married, but when I was gone, I know it's terrible with my mother, and then when I come back and she's watching me deteriorate in front of her, I mean, I couldn't imagine that. I don't have children, but I just couldn't imagine watching your son, perish.
What is the correct approach to help the veterans when they come back? Because we know that in the Hispanic community, family is everything. So we always want to look for ways to help our family members. What is the correct approach for this in these situations?
For me, it was to talk about it, my belief in God, my faith in God, and just being open to trying new things. I've tried Reiki, float tanks, cold plunges, prayer, counselors, I mean, everything. But I think the veteran has to trust that resource for them to truly open up and put down their armor, for them to say, "Hey, this is what's happening." And for us here in the U.S., we have to say, "Hey, if this is not helping you, let's try this other method," and be okay with it. Like I said earlier, we're such complex beings that healing doesn't look, it's not just an answer to fix everything. It's not just one answer. There's several, and there's so many resources out there that we should be able to take advantage of them. And I think the start is to really get to know these guys and have them trust you and go from there.
Rafa, with Memorial Day approaching, what would be your message for the Hispanic community?
Well, I mean, the message for the Hispanic community is that, we are an integral part of the American story. And from the very beginning. And we have, earned our place in American, throughout American history, precisely because of the blood, sweat, tears, and sacrifice of all the very courageous Latino soldiers that have served, fought, and died for this country.
Eric, Rafa, on behalf of our network, gracias por su servicio a nuestra patria. I just said in Spanish, thank you for your service to our country. And thank you for watching International Roundtable. I'm Patti Valencia, and we'll see you next time.
Despite the capture of Mount Suribachi, the Battle of Iwo Jima would rage on for another month. It was some of the fiercest and bloodiest fighting in the Pacific Theater, with 6,821 U.S. troops killed. The statue of 6 Marines, 3 of which later died in the battle, would become a fitting tribute to the courage and resolve of U.S. Marines everywhere. Once the statue was completed in plaster, it was carefully disassembled and trucked to Brooklyn, New York for casting in bronze. The casting process, which required the work of expert craftsmen, took nearly 3 years. After the parts were cast, cleaned, and treated, they were reassembled into approximately a dozen pieces, the largest weighing more than 20 tons, and trucked back to Virginia. Here, they were bolted and welded together on this granite base. President Dwight D. Eisenhower dedicated the memorial on November 10th, 1954, the 179th anniversary of the United States Marine Corps. The Iwo Jima Memorial is truly inspiring, containing the location and date of every major Marine Corps action up to the present time. It also contains some powerful inscriptions that communicate the dedication and sacrifice of the United States Marines throughout American history. These are my favorites. Uncommon valor was a common virtue, and Semper Fidelis, the Marine Corps' Latin motto, which means always faithful. Someone once said that sacrifice is the pinnacle of patriotism. Therefore, the willingness for our military veterans to sacrifice for our country has earned them our eternal gratitude. In my mind, a hero isn't a pop star or a sports champion. A hero is someone who has given their life to something bigger than themselves. Even Jesus called us to this heroic standard when he said, "There's no greater expression of love than to lay down your life for another." Thank God, such heroic men and women have gone before me, my family, and my country. I celebrate their lives this Memorial Day in America.